Welcome to One Room at a Time. I'm your host, Atticus LeBlanc, founder and CEO of PadSplit, the nation's largest co-living marketplace. And I've spent more than 2 decades in affordable housing as a property owner, developer, and now entrepreneur. This show brings together some of the brightest minds in housing and policy to talk about what's working, what isn't, and how we can create real solutions to one of the biggest challenges of our time. Today, I'm honored to welcome one of the most respected voices in housing policy, Pamela Hughes Patenaude. Pam is a nationally recognized policy expert with more than 4 decades of experience in government, nonprofits, and private industry. She served as Deputy Secretary of HUD, managing day-to-day operations of the $52 billion agency and overseeing $37 billion in disaster recovery funding. She's led major organizations shaping policy, including the J. Ronald Terwilliger Foundation, the Bipartisan Policy Center, and the Urban Land Institute's Terwilliger Center for Housing. Today, Pam continues to make an impact as a PadSplit advisory board member, thank you, Pam, a trustee for Habitat for Humanity International, and vice chair of the Bipartisan Policy Center's board of directors. Pam, welcome to the show. How are you doing this afternoon?
Thanks, Atticus. Great to be with you this afternoon.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you, and good to see you again. So you are truly one of the most respected voices in housing, and I'm not sure that the bio I read does it justice, especially considering we're talking about spanning 40 years here. Would love for you to just share a little bit with the audience about what inspired you to pursue a career in housing and community development in the first place.
So I'm approaching 44 years in the affordable housing space, but it all started my senior year in college with an internship at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. My mentor, my late uncle, and his wife, my aunt, were the 2 people that really inspired me to pursue a career in affordable housing. My uncle was a regional administrator at HUD when I was in college, and he said, "How about doing an internship in Washington for a semester?" So I left the Granite State for DC, and that's where it all started back in the fall of 1982. When I graduated from college, it was a recession. The first one that I can remember, and ended up staying in New Hampshire for the first year after college, working for New Hampshire Housing Finance Agency, where I administered the Section 8 program. So that's where it all started. Shortly after my year at New Hampshire Housing, I went back to Washington, back to HUD during the Reagan administration.
So it's funny. I don't think I've ever talked to you before about your uncle and the inspiration that was, and the personal familial connection. But I have to imagine, starting in the Reagan years, you've seen quite a lot of changes in the, well, I guess some problems have not changed nearly as much as we would have hoped they would, but you've certainly seen a lot of changes regardless across Washington, housing policy, and just the perspectives overall. What do you think has changed the most in the housing sector, particularly as it relates to how we approach housing policy?
So I don't think a whole lot has changed. When I think back, one of the people that inspired me at a very young age and continues to this day is former HUD Secretary Henry Cisneros. Back then, when I met him in the early 80s, he was the mayor of San Antonio. And we were meeting with him on what was then the Section 8 certificate program, which became a demonstration to be the housing voucher program. And think about it today, the program pretty much operates the same way. The changes that were made from the certificate to the housing voucher program, providing flexibility, mobility of a voucher, but not a lot has changed in terms of the programs. You know, some programs were added during the 90s at HUD, but most of the programs have been around for 4 and more decades. What I think has changed in housing policy is the acknowledgement that housing, which was not even close to a top tier domestic policy issue for the first 35 plus years of my career, is now a top tier number 1 in many polls, that it's the most critical issues facing Americans today. So I think that's the biggest change, that there is now a bipartisan agreement that there is a housing affordability challenge in this country of epic proportion.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the urgency is there, but I mean, I think to your point, Pam, what LIHTC started in 1986 under Reagan,
It did during the
right?
Reagan administration, and I remember it being so complex that I had a hard time getting my arms around it. It was, I was there for all the early
Mm.
training. And LIHTC has been by far the most successful program creating, new affordable housing units, over 3 million units. But not a lot's changed with that program. Some tweaks to the program, some, minor improvements. Uh, But the program, continues to serve, um, very low income individuals, but only 1 in 4 that are eligible for, subsidy, that qualify for a subsidy, are able to access a subsidy. So I do think this is a time for us to look for alternatives to federal subsidies, because at the end of the
Sure.
day, the money is coming from the federal government down to the states and, localities.
Yeah. And there's I mean, I know we've increased low-income housing tax credit funding recently, but still, I have to imagine. I don't think anyone's of the opinion that we have enough funding to address, to your point, the urgency that exists today. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely true. And we won't. The HUD budget has, quadrupled, and we're serving fewer people. So we need alternatives. And I know when we met, almost 3 years ago, what intrigued me so much about PadSplit was no federal subsidy, involved. And we also, I think the other thing that has changed is there is certainly an acknowledgement. I don't know if there's an acceptance yet universally, but an acknowledgement that so much of the barriers exist at the local level. And all real estate is local, but that I think is beginning to be, ring certainly bipartisan support for regulatory reform.
Yeah. Well, it's funny talking about even going back uh, 42 years. I remember reading a report uh, out of the Reagan administration on the need for just better private market housing solutions, and how zoning was a barrier even back then. And to think, like, we're still having these conversations 42 years later, and we still haven't completely addressed that problem, and the ability for just the overall private markets to address affordable housing in the way that I think they certainly did well beyond 40 years ago. As we think about SROs, I was just on a panel earlier this week with some folks from the Pew Research Center and the Institute for Justice, who were running a panel on the fact that, okay, well, look, like, we've lost 2.5 million units was what Pew had estimated in terms of SROs, which were not subsidized just, I think, from 1960 onward. And so, to your point, like, there have to be a number of private market solutions out there, of which I hope PadSplit is one. Um, but yeah, it's funny to think that the need has been there for 40 plus years, and here we are still today talking about it without some of the local policy changes that I know we would all like to see, which allow some of these other models.
Yeah, naturally occurring affordable housing is critical, but yet, very seldom talked about. And we are losing affordable units. We have LIHTC units that with expiring use restrictions, Section 8 contracts expiring. And again, it's almost like somebody wins the lottery when they qualify for an affordable housing unit. So there'll never be enough. The demand, continues to increase. And the United States is so far behind on building new supply, yet there's enough square footage out there to house all Americans if we just start looking at things a little bit differently.
Which
like PadSplit
yeah, there
does
we
every
go.
day.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
Perfect segue. So how did PadSplit manage to get you onto the advisory board, Pam, and what made you think that shared housing would be a solution potentially for the housing problems that you've seen over the last 44 years?
Well, I think back to my grandparents, who I never had the pleasure to meet, but they were Irish immigrants, came over from Ireland, and they lived in shared housing. They worked in the textile mills, the Amoskeag mills in Manchester, New Hampshire. They went on to be homeowners. They bought a home on the west side of Manchester because they were able to save, a small amount of money, but they lived in, a co-living environment.
Sure.
And So it worked then, it works now. And why people see it as anything other than an unbelievably good solution to address the housing. And I look at across different demographics. We've got young men and women graduating from college that either can go back and live with their parents, but there might not be jobs where their parents live, or they can go broke, try to rent something on their own, or you know seek alternative forms of housing that are not subsidized, co-living being one of them, and be able to save. And kids today are faced with, student loan debts that are unbearable and rising rents, continue to see rising rents in most markets. So I think it is, wonderful solution, for young men and women just getting started. And then on the opposite end, as I approach my 65th birthday, I'm thinking about the senior citizens in America, widows, widowers that are living in these big 4 and 5 bedroom houses. We're overhoused in many ways with so much square footage unused, but seniors being able to stay in their homes, but perhaps can't stay in their homes because their property insurance and their taxes continue to increase, even if they don't have a mortgage.
Yeah.
So I think it's a wonderful solution for people to age in place as well.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And are you in DC now, Pam? Or are you in New
I
Hampshire?
am. I'm in Northern Virginia today.
Yeah, I find that anytime I'm having conversations with people in DC, I need to give a lot shorter explanation of what co-living is, because literally every staffer on the Hill is already doing this, and many of our elected officials, because it's the only thing that they can figure out how to afford in DC living there. So it's always been a
And
different
very
conversation.
few members talk about that, though. I had a really good friend who was a member of Congress from Pennsylvania. He actually had worked with me at HUD. And I asked him, and on the first meeting when he was a House member, I said, "Where do you live?" He said, "Right here on my sofa." And I thought he was kidding.
Mm,
And he said, "Pam, I have 6 kids. Of course I can't afford rent." And then I have other friends, United States senators, that 4 and 5 senators share a house together on Capitol Hill because they can't afford
sure,
the rents on Capitol Hill.
sure. Yeah. Next time I go to DC, I'll have to ask them who's responsible for taking out the trash and taking dirty dishes out of the sink and whatnot. That's always something I get asked by policymakers, and so it'd be great to be able to turn the tables around. And so, like, what do you think needs to happen for people to take this solution more seriously, particularly if the staffers and even some of the elected officials are already doing this in DC? Is it just the disconnect between local issues and federal policy?
I don't know if there's a disconnect or still a lack of um, visibility.
Mm,
We need to elevate. We've got to raise the visibility of this solution. It's people just constantly relying on the federal budget. Well, the pressure on the federal budget is intense, and we have to look for non-subsidized, market rate solutions. And this is a perfect solution for most people,
yeah.
including people, that are going through a divorce, and, families that are having to live in separate cities because of the jobs.
And it's bipartisan, right? I mean, what's been so interesting to me throughout this journey is that I was pointing out last week, like New York City just published their roadmap to shared housing and reinvigorating the SRO concept, which of course has been prevalent in New York City literally since the beginning of time. Alexander Hamilton, I think, rented a room. Actually, I'm almost positive rented a room in New York. And then at the same time, you've got Americans for Prosperity that also publishes model policy suggesting that cities relook at this model. So we've got Americans for Prosperity and New York City, very, very different political makeups, both promoting the same solution. I think it just kind of points to the fact that this is really a circular political spectrum to some degree, rather than a linear one. And I don't know if you're seeing this, but as someone who's probably worked across both sides of the aisle more than anyone else in housing, I'm wondering if you're seeing the same thing, or what you think the meeting of the minds is attributable to.
I think for the first time in a very, very long time, because we haven't had any really major legislation, housing legislation passed. We came close, with the road, but which did not get included in
The defense bill.
the Defense Act, but still alive. I think for the first time there is bipartisan agreement on the problem. I don't think we're quite there on the solution, and I would love to see co-living as one of the solutions. And truly, going back to the 2016 campaign, I spent a lot of time, as you recall, there were a lot of candidates in that presidential primary, both on the Democrat and the Republican side, talking to all but just a couple of the candidates one-on-one, and having some candidates believe that housing was not their problem at all. Some acknowledging that it was a problem, but it was a coastal problem. And now for the first time, we have, Tim Scott and Elizabeth Warren working together,
Yep.
which is pretty unbelievable that those two could, have a meeting of the minds. And now we hope that's going to happen on the House side as well. So I do believe that this bipartisan agreement on the problem will hopefully lead to some solutions, and that we will be able to elevate, a co-living platform as an alternative to subsidized housing.
What do you think? I mean, in terms of federal policy outlook over the next year, Pam, I mean, you've been inside HUD and in the halls of Washington for quite a long time. Do you see meaningful federal solutions, just given the overall gap that we see and knowing the funding constraints that are there?
I think reducing regulatory barriers, and you said this dates back quite a while. Well, Jack Kemp was the first one to actually elevate with Not in My Backyard, the document today, and he served as the HUD secretary under Bush 41. That document, Not in My Backyard, is as relevant today as it was when Jack was the secretary of HUD. I think that's where there's some agreement. And, reducing regulatory barriers, I've long advocated that we need to tie some of the federal funding, the entitlement funding, such as CDBG or the home program, where there's formula, allocation. It's allocated by formula, that there needs to be some carrots and sticks that,
Sure.
States, and obviously states aren't always the problem. It's more at the local level, but that they are encouraged to make changes that are going to provide avenues for more production, provide avenues for allowing for co-living.
Sure.
And so I think that's where we're going to see the changes, big changes. And I think this administration, and that's something that has been bipartisan. Henry Cisneros and Jack Kemp agreed on that. They worked together on it.
You mean in terms of removing regulatory barriers?
Removing or reducing. Obviously, Mel Martinez, when he was HUD secretary, that was certainly one of his highest priorities. Secretary Carson did the same thing. Secretary Donovan focused on regulatory barriers. Now we need to say, and this will take Congress to cooperate, but why not tie some of this federal funding to be able to incentivize communities? Why should all communities benefit the same way when so much of the problem is at the local level?
Yeah. I mean,
and the elected officials, the mayors play a really important role in this country. So educating the mayors, encouraging the mayors, giving them the courage, to stand up and to make some of these tough decisions.
Yeah. Well,
the NIMBYs are still there.
I know we saw some small federal funding under the Biden administration that was encouraging, or I think it was available to cities that were proactive in trying to address some of the regulatory barriers. But we've never really seen a removal of carrots, and certainly not a stick. Do you think that there's an opportunity in this administration to see at least a removal of carrot as we think about whether it's, to your point, CDBG funding or transportation funding, right? I mean, if you require 1 acre lots for every house, it's just a matter of geometry that you're going to push people farther and farther away from their jobs and services. But what do you think the likelihood is that anyone's going to have I'd say the fortitude to maybe remove some of those carrots that have kind of promoted these bad local policies for years?
Well, we have a president that understands real estate.
That's true.
And I think the president, more than anybody, understands the regulatory barriers and what it takes to be able to get, you know, uh, uh, housing development under construction.
Sure.
The time delays are incredible. So the president is talking about his affordability agenda, and so there's acknowledgement at the highest level of government that there's a problem. And, I think deregulation has been a big part of this administration's agenda, and I think it will continue. So if we, hopefully the federal agencies, you're correct in saying that it's not just housing, but transportation. If we can get Secretary Duffy and Secretary Turner together in a room and figure out how they can tie some of this federal funding, incentivize.
Exactly. Yeah. It's all about incentive alignment, and sometimes the removal of those incentives to really spur action. As I've been operating a marketplace, it's one thing I've learned very clearly is you can't force anybody to do anything, but you can change the incentives and sometimes get very different results.
And time is money in real estate. And, the longer a deal drags out, the more expensive it is. I have been involved in Puerto Rico for more than 8 years now since Hurricane Maria. And some of the units that have been in the pipeline, this is an example, and trying to identify what are the barriers, what's keeping these properties from breaking ground. And it's, local regulatory barriers.
Well, and you see some of these low-income housing tax credit developments that cost twice as much per unit as their peers, which I think, to your point, is probably a lot to do with just the different regulatory levels and the amount of time it takes to get a deal done.
Yeah, I mean, just even with SHPO, I think we need to look at the state historic preservation. Department of Interior plays a role in that. We can get the Secretary of Interior involved and have somebody actually, articulate this in number of days, the delays. And every day there's a delay, we're seeing increased costs and the number of consultants that have to be hired to be able to get a LIHTC deal.
They got to get paid, right? As one of my old co-founders used to say, everybody needs to wet their beak. But in any case, well, Pam, I want to for the last question for this particular session, because we're close to end of first half. You've been in and around the housing policy space for a long time. Just curious to know what's kept you passionate about these issues: housing, disaster recovery, homelessness, and what fuels you to keep going.
I think the people that I've met along the way, I can remember my first visit to a public housing authority in Baltimore back when I was a senior in college. And you don't forget the faces of the people that you see. I've been involved in way too many hurricanes and disaster recovery, both as the assistant secretary during Hurricane Katrina and then as deputy secretary during the 2017 disasters with Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And meeting the disaster survivors, again, it all comes down to what their homes are destroyed during disasters. These people who once were homeowners or renters are, homeless because of a natural disaster, no fault to their own. So just looking back at my time, I think that's what motivates me. And then, having grandchildren and worried about what that generation, how are we going to house that generation? And my grandchildren ages 2 months to 6 years old. I think about it. My parents helped me become a first-time home buyer when my husband and I got married. And the next generation, we were able to help them become first-time home buyers. But to become a first-time home buyer is becoming, further and further from a reality.
Sure.
So just the people that I've met along the way and home, without a home, it's the foundation for everything. And as I said earlier during our conversation, it was never a top tier. It was just a given. Of course, everybody lives in a home. Well, not everybody lives in a home. We have 750,000 people who live on the streets on any given night. And in a country as rich as this one, we have to use all the tools in the toolbox to help everybody be able to call someplace home.
Yeah, no question, 100%. And thank you for your continued passion for this issue, Pam. What's been an incredible start to our conversation. So let's pause here. But when we come back for part two, want to dig a little bit deeper into how we can strengthen housing policy from the local level all the way to Congress. And for our audience, don't forget to join us for part two of this episode of One Room at a Time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Atticus.